I've lived on this patch of dirt for 24 years, and I've learned that the silence of the countryside isn't actually silent if you listen closely enough to the wind through the stalks. My grandfather used to say that the corn has ears, a tired old joke that felt less funny. Every year, the isolation sank deeper into my bones. The Miller place is about 6 miles from the nearest paved road, tucked into a valley where the cellular signal goes to die. And the only company I usually have is the crickets. It was a humid Tuesday in late August when the air turned sour and thick. The kind of heat that makes you feel like you're breathing through a wet sponge. I was sitting in the kitchen, nursing a lukewarm beer and listening to the rhythmic hum of the old refrigerator that really should have been replaced a decade ago. The wiring in this house is a nightmare of frayed copper and desperate patches, so the lights have always had a habit of dimming when the wind picks up. Out in the North 40, just past the edge of the gravel driveway, stood the scarecrow I'd built to keep the crows from ravaging what was left of the garden. I called him Old Silas, a haphazard construction of hemlock beams, an old flannel shirt stuffed with dry straw, and a burlap sack for a head. He was supposed to be a deterrent, but in the twilight, he always looked like a man who had simply given up and decided to stand perfectly still forever. The first flicker happened just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the entire field in a bruised shade of purple and gray. It was a quick dip in power, just enough to make the overhead kitchen bulb buzz and die for a fraction of a second before humming back to life. I didn't think anything of it until I glanced out the window and noticed that Silas wasn't where he was supposed to be in the center of the patch. He was about 10 feet to the left, standing right on the edge of the tilled soil. His straw arms angled slightly differently than I remembered. I rubbed my eyes, blaming the long day and the lack of sleep, and took a long draw of my beer while the crickets outside seemed to stop their chirping all at once. The second flicker was longer, maybe 2 full seconds of total darkness that left me staring at my own reflection in the darkened window pane. When the yellow light returned, my heart gave a sharp, painful throb against my ribs, because Silas was now standing on the gravel of the driveway. He was facing the house, his burlap face tilted upward as if he were trying to catch a scent on the stagnant evening air. I stood up so fast, my chair skidded across the linoleum with a screech that sounded like a wounded animal, my hands suddenly trembling. There is no way a wooden frame anchored 2 feet into the ground can move that fast, or move at all, without someone dragging it. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from beside the wood stove, feeling the weight of it, and trying to convince myself that some local kids were playing a prank on the lonely bachelor. But there were no footprints in the gravel other than my own, and no sound of retreating footsteps or stifled laughter from the darkness beyond the porch. The third flicker was a stuttering mess, the lights pulsing like a dying heartbeat, while the television in the corner hissed with static that sounded like a human voice. During those flashes of light, I saw him moving through the yard, not walking, but appearing in different spots like a glitch in a film strip. First, he was by the old oak tree. Then he was standing next to my truck. And then he was at the bottom of the porch steps. I retreated into the hallway, my back hitting the wall as I tried to find the words to shout a warning or a threat. But my throat felt like it was filled with dry straw. The house groaned as the wind finally picked up, a low moan that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and settle in my teeth. Every time the light failed, he got closer. And every time the light returned, the details of his costume became more terrifyingly vivid. The flannel shirt wasn't just stuffed with straw. It was bulging in places that looked like muscle, and the burlap over his head was wet around the mouth area. I realized then that the smell I had attributed to the humid night was actually the stench of something rotting, something that had been kept in a dark, damp place for a long time. The power dipped again, a long, agonizing stretch of blackness where I could hear the heavy, wet thud of something landing on the wooden porch boards. I fumbled for my flashlight, my fingers slick with sweat. And when the beam finally cut through the dark, it landed on a pair of mud-caked boots. He was standing right outside the screen door, his straw-filled fingers curled around the wooden frame, the burlap mask pressed flat against the mesh. I could see the light through the holes in the sack, but there were no wooden beams behind that fabric, only the glint of two very human, very wide eyes. The lights flickered one more time, a violent surge that popped the bulb in the hallway and showered me in glass, leaving me in total, suffocating darkness. In that final moment of light, I saw that the Scarecrow wasn't a monster at all, but a man I recognized from the missing person posters in town, his mouth sewn shut with fishing line. He wasn't the one moving. Someone was behind him, holding him up like a macabre puppet and pushing him toward my door. I heard the screen door creak open, the sound of metal hinges screaming in the night, and the heavy smell of the cornfield flooded the house. I scrambled back into the kitchen, tripping over the very chair I had been sitting in just minutes ago, my flashlight rolling away across the floor. The beam of the fallen light hit the wall, showing the shadow of two figures entering the room, one limp and stuffed with straw, the other tall and silent. I reached for the phone on the counter, but the line had been cut, the cord dangling like a dead snake in the gloom. The crickets started up again, a deafening roar that drowned out my own ragged breathing. As I backed into the corner of the pantry, I could hear the wet, sliding sound of the burlap being pulled off ahead, and the sound of someone else drawing a long, jagged breath. No one knows I'm out here tonight, and the nearest neighbor won't think to check on me for at least another week. The lights didn't come back on this time, and as the shadow moved across the floor toward me, I realized the Scarecrow was never meant to keep the birds away. It was an invitation, a way to see who was home and who was brave enough to stay in the dark. I can feel the straw brushing against my ankles now, and the cold metal of a needle pricking the skin of my neck. The silence of the countryside has finally returned. But this time, I'm the one who has to be perfectly still. I wonder how long I'll have to stand in the North 40 before the next person notices the lights flickering in the old Miller place. The heat is still unbearable, but I suspect I won't be feeling it for much longer once the thread starts to pull tight. I hope the next owner likes the smell of the corn, because it's the last thing they're ever going to know. My eyes are open, but the world is just a series of flickers now, and the man holding the needle is leaning in to whisper that I'm going to make a beautiful Silas. I can hear the crows gathering on the roof, waiting for their new companion to take his place in the field. The darkness is total now, and I can't even remember what the light felt like. Living on my grandfather's old cattle ranch in the valley is the kind of quiet that people from the city think they want until they actually get it. It's a 4-mile drive to the nearest paved road, and at night, the darkness is so thick you can practically feel it pressing against the windows of the farmhouse. My dad inherited the place 5 years ago, and since then, it's just been the three of us, me, him, and my little sister, Maya. We spend our days mending fences and hauling feed, a routine so grueling that by 8 o'clock, we're usually all dead to the world. The silence of the countryside is usually broken only by the occasional lowing of a cow or the rustle of wind through the tall grass. It's a peaceful existence, or at least it was, until the middle of last August when the heat wave hit and the nights started getting weird. I remember the first time I heard it, lying in bed with the window cracked just an inch to let in a breeze that never came. It was exactly midnight, the old grandfather clock in the hall chiming 12 times. And then, from out near the north pasture, I heard a voice. It wasn't a scream or a shout, just a low, conversational tone, like two people catching up after a long day. I told myself it was just a drifter, or maybe a hiker who had gotten turned around. But we haven't seen a stranger on this land in years. The voice was deep and steady, a baritone murmur that seemed to carry across the dry earth with impossible clarity. I sat up, straining my ears. But as soon as the wind shifted, the sound vanished into the rustle of the cornstalks. I lay back down, my heart thudding against my ribs, telling myself that the heat was finally starting to get to me. The next morning, I checked the north pasture for any signs of trespassing, looking for flattened grass or discarded trash. I found nothing but the usual hoof prints and the sun-bleached remains of a cedar post that had fallen over years ago. My father was already out by the tractor, his face etched with the usual lines of exhaustion and grit. I didn't mention the voice to him because he doesn't have much patience for stories that don't involve the immediate business of survival. We worked through the blistering afternoon, the air thick with the smell of diesel and dry earth. And by sundown, I had almost forgotten the incident. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the yard, that familiar sense of unease returned. I found myself checking the locks on the doors twice, a habit I'd never had before in a place where we usually left the keys in the ignition of the trucks. Maya was quiet during dinner, poking at her potatoes with a distracted look on her face that made me wonder if she'd heard something too. I asked her if she was feeling all right, and she just nodded, though her eyes kept darting toward the dark window behind my head. The heat seemed to amplify the silence, making the walls of the old house feel like they were closing in on us. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I just sat in the dark, watching the red numbers of my digital clock creep toward 12. When the clock hit midnight, the silence didn't just break. It shattered into something unrecognizable. This time, the sound was closer, coming from the direction of the main barn where we keep the younger heifers. It was my father's voice, unmistakable in its gravelly cadence, though the words were just slightly blurred at the edges. I walked down the hall to his room and found him fast asleep, his rhythmic snoring proof that he wasn't the one out in the dark. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine, despite the 100-degree heat, a primal instinct telling me that something was fundamentally wrong. I crept to the window and looked out toward the barn, the silver moonlight illuminating the structure in stark, jagged lines. There was no light on in the barn, yet the voice continued, discussing the price of hay and the need to fix the southern fence. Then a second voice joined in, a higher, softer tone that sounded exactly like Maya's giggle when she's being mischievous. My blood turned to ice as I realized the Maya voice was coming from the pigpen, a low-slung building tucked behind the barn. I grabbed the heavy maglite from the kitchen drawer, my fingers trembling as I fumbled with the casing. I didn't wake my father, partly because I was afraid he wouldn't believe me, and partly because I was afraid he would. I slipped out the back door, the grass feeling like wet needles against my bare ankles. The air was unnaturally still, the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath before a scream. Every step away from the house felt like a betrayal of my own safety, but I had to know what was happening. I reached the barn door just as the last stroke of midnight echoed from the house, and I froze, my hand hovering over the latch. Inside, I could hear a wet, rhythmic slapping sound, followed by a voice that sounded exactly like mine, reciting my own third-grade spelling bee words. I threw the door open and swung the light around, the beam cutting through the dust motes and landing on the first stall. The heifer inside didn't look at me. She just stared at the wall, her jaw moving in a way that wasn't chewing, but forming the shape of syllables. But as the light moved lower, I realized she wasn't alone. There was a man crouched in the straw behind her, his fingers buried deep in the soft tissue of her neck. He was gaunt, his skin the color of old parchment, and he was whispering into the animal's ear, his own throat bulging with the effort. I realized then that he wasn't just talking, he was training them, his hand moving like a puppeteer's inside the animal's throat to manipulate the sound. I saw more of them then, silhouettes emerging from the shadows of the rafters and the empty stalls throughout the barn. They were dressed in tattered clothes that looked hauntingly familiar, my old shirts, my father's discarded work pants, even Maya's lost sweater. One man stepped forward into the light, and my heart stopped because he was wearing my father's favorite flannel shirt. He didn't attack. He just stood there and began to speak in my father's exact cadence, telling me to go back to bed and forget everything. I looked at his face and realized it wasn't a mask. He had meticulously tucked and stitched his own features into a shape that mimicked my father's bone structure. They weren't monsters. They were people, squatters, who had been living in our crawl spaces and barn lofts for months, learning our lives. They had been practicing, using the livestock as organic speakers, vibrating the animals' vocal cords with their own hands to perfect the mimicry before they tried it themselves. I backed away, the flashlight beam dancing wildly, and I heard the sound of my sister's voice coming from the hayloft above me. But when I looked up, I saw Maya standing at the farmhouse window across the yard, her silhouette small and terrified. The mire in the loft continued to scream for help, the sound perfectly capturing her specific pitch and frantic panic. I realized they had been watching us from the shadows of the attic, listening to our every word, memorizing our deepest secrets. They weren't just taking our voices, they were taking our identities, one practiced syllable at a time. I ran back to the house, locking every door and window, but the voices didn't stop. They just moved closer to the walls. I burst into my father's room and shook him awake, my words tumbling out in a frantic, incoherent mess. He grabbed his rifle, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and sudden, sharp clarity. We huddled in the living room, the three of us pressed together on the sofa, while the sounds outside intensified. Now, every night at midnight, the family outside holds a dinner conversation on the porch. I can hear them discussing what to do with the originals once the livestock has learned the scripts perfectly. My father sits in the living room with a shotgun across his lap, but he won't look at me, and I'm starting to wonder if the man in the chair is actually him. Sometimes I hear my own voice coming from the kitchen when I know I haven't opened my mouth, a perfect replica of my own laughter. The cows are all dead now, their throats worked raw and discarded in the fields, and I know it's only a matter of time before they don't need the animals anymore. We are trapped in a house, surrounded by versions of ourselves that are more patient than we could ever be. I tried to call for help, but the voice on the other end of the line was my own, telling me that everything was fine and to stop calling. I can see them through the slats of the shutters, standing in the yard, just waiting for the sun to go down again. They move in perfect unison, a choreographed mimicry of our daily chores that makes my stomach churn with dread. My father hasn't spoken a word in 3 days, and I'm terrified that if he does, it won't be his voice that comes out. The air in the house feels thin, as if they are breathing the same oxygen we are from the other side of the vents. I found a pile of my own hair in the crawl space this morning, neatly harvested from my hairbrush over the course of months. They are building themselves from the pieces of us we leave behind. weaving our habits into their own twisted existence. Last night, I heard myself whispering through the bedroom wall, telling me a secret that only I should know. I don't know how much longer the locks will hold against people who know exactly where we keep the spare keys. The silence of the countryside isn't peaceful anymore. It's a void that they are filling with our stolen lives. I can hear the floorboards creaking in the hallway right now. A specific weight that belongs to my father, but my father is sitting right in front of me, staring at the wall with empty, unblinking eyes. The person in the hallway just called my name, and for a second, I almost answered. I can hear the livestock beginning to low in the distance, but the sound is turning into a rhythmic, human chant. They are coming closer to the door now, and they aren't even trying to be quiet anymore. I can hear them laughing, and the terrifying thing is that it sounds exactly like the way my family used to laugh before we came here. I don't think I can trust my own ears anymore, or even my own reflection in the darkened windows. The man in the flannel shirt is standing on the porch, looking directly into the camera of the doorbell. He's smiling, and I can see his teeth have been filed down to match the exact gaps in my father's grin. I can hear the scratching at the window glass, a soft, persistent sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. There are no more animals left on the farm to hide behind. They are ready to come inside and take their places at the table. I can hear the grandfather clock beginning its first chime for midnight. 3. Each chime feels like a nail being driven into the coffin of our lives. By the time it hits 12, I don't think there will be any difference between us and them. The door handle is starting to turn, slow and deliberate, just like my father always does when he comes in from the fields. I'm holding my breath, but I can hear someone else's breath right behind my ear, perfectly synchronized with mine. I turned around, but there was no one there, just the empty air vibrating with the echo of my own heart. Maya started crying, but the sound didn't come from her mouth. It came from the heating vent in the floor. My father finally stood up, but he didn't pick up the gun. He just walked toward the front door as if he were in a trance. I screamed for him to stop, but my voice came out as a low, guttural rasp, the sound of a voice that has been used too much. I clutched my throat, feeling the skin ripple and shift under my fingers like liquid wax. The man on the porch reached out and opened the door, and the light from the hallway hit his face, revealing the fresh stitches along his jawline. He stepped inside and tipped a non-existent hat, greeting us in a voice that was clearer and more us than we were. Behind him, dozens of others stood in the yard, each one a slightly blurred copy of someone I used to know. They didn't rush in. They just waited for us to acknowledge the transition. I looked at my hands and saw the skin was raw and calloused from being forced to crawl. My fingernails cracked and broken into jagged shapes. My father embraced the intruder, and for a moment, I couldn't tell which one was bleeding and which one was whole. The Maya from the loft crawled through the window, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. She sat down at the table and began to mimic the way my sister eats her cereal. every clink of the spoon a perfect replica. I realized that they hadn't just been training the animals to sound like us. They had been breaking us down to take the animals' places. The livestock didn't start mimicking humans. The humans started replacing the livestock until we were the only ones left to harvest. I tried to run for the back door, but my muscles were cramped from days of hiding in the cellar. My body forced into a hunched, awkward shape. The man in my father's shirt looked at me with pity. His voice, a perfect melody of fatherly concern. He told me it wouldn't hurt much longer, and that the pasture was ready for the new herd. I can hear the others outside now, the sounds of people tending to the fields and people fixing the fences. But I know they aren't people, and I know that whatever is left of me won't be able to tell the difference soon. The transition is almost complete, and the midnight chimes are fading into a dull, rhythmic thumping. I am riding this with the last of my human coordination, hidden under the porch where they haven't looked yet, but I can hear the sniffing at the floorboards above me. A keen, predatory sense of smell that no human should have. Someone just called my name from the kitchen, and this time I found myself moving toward the sound without even thinking. It's over, and the worst part is that no one will ever know we're gone, because the voices will never stop. I never thought I would be the kind of person to get lost in my own backyard, or at least what felt like it. I grew up in the Midwest, surrounded by nothing but flat land and the swaying green oceans of corn that seemed to stretch on until they hit the hem of the sky. My car had been making this rhythmic thumping sound for about 10 miles before the engine finally gave a pathetic little cough and died right on the shoulder of Route 52. There wasn't a house in sight, just the shimmering heat rising off the asphalt and the endless, suffocating wall of corn on either side of the road. I checked my phone, but the signal bar was a hollow, mocking zero, which was typical for this stretch of nowhere. I figured if I just walked a little way into the field, maybe I could get a bit of elevation on one of those irrigation mounds to catch a single bar of LTE. It seemed like a sensible plan at the time. Just a quick detour to call a tow truck and get back to my life. The dirt was dry and crunched loudly under my boots as I stepped off the gravel and into the first row of stalks. The transition from the open road to the interior of the field was jarring, like walking into a room and having someone slam the door behind you. The air inside the rows was stagnant and heavy, smelling of damp earth and the sweet, sickly scent of ripening grain. I started walking, counting my steps to make sure I didn't lose track of how far I'd gone from the shoulder. Every few steps, I would hold my phone up toward the sky, watching the screen with a desperate kind of hope. The corn was tall this year, easily 8 or 9 feet, and it blocked out everything but the sun directly overhead. I must have walked about 50 yards when I realized the ground wasn't sloping up like I thought it would. I decided to turn back, figuring I'd just wait by the car for a passing motorist, even if it took hours. But when I turned around, row I had just walked down didn't look the same anymore. It felt narrower, the stalks leaning inward as if they were trying to knit themselves together across the path. I started walking back in what I was certain was the right direction, but the road never appeared. I walked for 5 minutes, then 10, and the panic started to bloom in the base of my stomach like a cold, heavy stone. I told myself it was just the perspective, that every row of corn looks identical, and I had probably just drifted into a parallel lane. I tried to cut across the rows, pushing through the sharp, papery leaves that sliced at my forearms and neck. The leaves made a deafening, dry, rustling sound that seemed to echo and bounce off the stalks until I couldn't tell where the noise was coming from. I stopped to catch my breath, and that was the first time I heard it. It wasn't the wind, because the air was absolutely dead. Not even a whisper of a breeze to move the tassels above me. It was a sound of something heavy moving through the stalks, maybe 20 feet to my left. It was a slow, deliberate sound. The sound of someone stepping carefully through the dry debris on the ground. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs, so hard I thought it might actually break something. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and fragile in the vast, golden silence. There was no answer, only the sudden cessation of the rustling, as if whatever was there had frozen at the exact same moment I did. I started walking again, faster this time, not caring about the direction as much as I cared about putting distance between myself and that sound. But every time I moved, the sound moved with me, mirroring my pace with terrifying precision. I tried to look through the gaps in the stalks, but the corn was too thick, a vertical cage of yellow and green that blurred into a solid wall. I realized then that I couldn't see the sun anymore, or rather, the light had turned a bruised, sickly orange as the afternoon began to lean toward evening. I turned a corner into a new row and stopped dead, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the middle of the path, was a single, muddy work boot, standing upright, as if the person wearing it had simply vanished into thin air. It was old and weathered, the leather cracked and peeling, and it looked like it had been sitting there for years. I backed away, my skin crawling with the sensation of 1,000 tiny insects walking over my spine. I turned and ran down the row, my lungs burning as I inhaled the dusty, pollen-choked air. I didn't look where I was going. I just pushed through the stalks, ignoring the way they whipped across my face. I stumbled into a small clearing, or what looked like one, but it wasn't a natural break in the crop. The corn here had been woven together, the stalks bent and tied with twine to create a sort of living wall that blocked the path entirely. It wasn't just a random mess. It was intentional, a deliberate modification of the environment to funnel me into a specific direction. I tried to pull the stalks apart, but the twine was thick and coated in something dark and sticky that smelled like old copper. I turned around to go back the way I came, but the path I had just run down was gone. Where there had been an open row seconds ago, there was now a dense, impenetrable thicket of corn that looked like it had been growing there forever. My mind screamed that this was impossible, that plants don't move that fast, that I was just disoriented and losing my mind. But then I saw the footprints in the soft dirt, fresh and deep, leading right up to where I was standing. They weren't mine. They were much larger, and the person making them wasn't wearing shoes. I stood there, trembling, and the silence of the field suddenly felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums like deep water. And then I felt it. It was a warm, moist sensation against the back of my neck, accompanied by a low, rattling intake of air. Someone was standing directly behind me, so close that I could feel the heat radiating from their body. I could hear the wet, rhythmic sound of their breathing, a jagged, broken noise that sounded like someone struggling to draw air through a throat full of grit. I was too terrified to turn around, too paralyzed by the sheer proximity of another human being in this desolate, trapped place. I realized with a sickening jolt that the shifting of the rows hadn't been the corn moving on its own. It was someone moving through the field ahead of me and behind me, closing off the paths with pre-cut bundles of stalks, herding me like livestock. They knew every inch of this place, every row and every dead end, and they had been playing with me the entire time. The breathing behind my ear grew louder, and I could smell the stench of unwashed skin and something sharp and chemical, like bleach. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My throat felt like it had been sewn shut with the same twine used to tie the corn. I slowly began to turn my head, my eyes watering from the strain and the absolute, gut-wrenching fear of what I was about to see. Just as the peripheral vision of my left eye caught a glimpse of a tattered, filth-stained shirt, the breathing stopped. A hand, calloused and incredibly strong, reached out and gripped my shoulder with a force that made my bones groan. I didn't see a face, just the blur of a man who looked like he had become part of the earth itself, his skin the color of dried husks. I wrenched myself away, fueled by a sudden, violent burst of adrenaline, and dived headlong into the stalks, not caring if they blinded me. I ran until my legs gave out, until I was crawling through the dirt, sobbing and gasping for air that felt like fire. I don't know how long I've been sitting here in the dark, but the sun is long gone, and the moon offers no light through the canopy of leaves. I can't find the road, and I can't find the clearing, and I certainly can't find my car. Every few minutes, the rustling starts up again, circling me, sometimes near, sometimes far, but always there. And every time I think I might have found a way out, I find another wall of woven stalks, another barrier built by hands that know exactly where I am. The breathing hasn't started again yet, but I can feel the vibration of footsteps through the ground beneath my palms. I'm sitting in a small pocket of space, my back against a cluster of stalks, clutching a sharp stone I found in the dirt. I know he's out there, waiting for me to move, waiting for me to try and run so he can start the hunt all over again. There is no sound of cars in the distance, no sirens, no voices of a search party coming to save the person who disappeared off Route 52. There is only the endless, shifting maze, and the man who lives within it, watching and waiting for the next breath I take. I can hear him now, just on the other side of the row, his fingers lightly brushing against the leaves as he passes. He's whistling a low, tuneless note that sets my teeth on edge and makes me want to scream until my lungs burst. But I stay silent, holding my breath until my head thumps, praying that the darkness will hide me just a little longer. I know it won't, though, because I can hear the twine being pulled tight just a few feet away. He's closing the last exit, sealing the room, and I am the only thing left inside with him. I can feel the air shift again, that same warmth against my neck, and I realize I never even heard him come back. This time, he doesn't grab me. He just stands there, breathing, waiting for me to finally turn around and look at him. I think I'm going to close my eyes now and hope that when I open them, I'm back in my car. But the smell of bleach and old earth is too strong, and the breathing is getting faster, matching the frantic rhythm of my own dying hope. He's leaning in now, his chin almost resting on my shoulder, and I can hear the wet click of his jaw as he prepares to speak. I don't want to hear what he has to say, but in this field, there is nowhere left to go, and no one left to hear me if I cry out. The corn is all around me, a golden, rustling tomb that has finally finished its work. I am here, and I am lost, and he is finally, truly, right behind me.